House burned down and just because the owner wouldn't pay HOA fees. Sounds unbelievable, right? But the flames were real. And the person behind it, a woman in a business suit, clipboard in hand, smiling like she hadn't just caused total devastation. That's when it stopped being a regular neighborhood dispute. I never imagined they'd bring in an outside party. I didn't think I'd ever need to pull out that old business card again of the name I'd long since walked away from. This story made headline as about here at Anna Drama Nest. You're going to hear everything they left out. If you were in my place, see a broken bar, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. Let's start with the basics. My name's Luke Thompson. I'm 45 years old, and I thought I'd seen everything the legal system could throw my way. After 2 decades working as a property rights attorney, I hung up my suit early for a quiet retirement. Maybe that was my first mistake. In hindsight, I should have known that peaceful doesn't exist when you're around people obsessed with control. But back then, all I wanted was a calm place to call home, somewhere I could finally unwind, away from legal battles and courtroom drama. Maple Grove felt like a dream when I first drove through it. Tree-lined streets, neatly maintained houses, the kind of place where neighbors wave and the smell of barbecues fills the air on weekends. I bought a cozy colonial-style house on Elm Street. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect for a guy who just wanted to grow roses and get lost in legal thrillers on the porch. The realtor briefly mentioned something about a homeowners association, but I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was one of those things where they make sure nobody paints their house orange or leaves rusty cars in the driveway. Yeehaw, broken bar. I was that naive. For the first few weeks, it was everything I had hoped. I set up a small home office, planted roses out front, even hung a bird feeder. Really trying to live the suburban dream. The neighbors seemed normal enough. Emily Green, next door, worked from home as an investigative journalist. Across the street was Tom Anderson, a retired security director who was always outside washing his car or trimming the hedges. Everything felt normal. Then came Laura Blackwell. It was a Tuesday morning around 9:30. I was sipping coffee on my porch when she came striding up my walkway like she was inspecting her kingdom. Sharply dressed, clipboard in hand, walking like she owned the entire block. She introduced herself as the executive director of some nonprofit and more importantly the president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. The way she said it, you'd think she was royalty. Mr. Thompson, she began coldly, skipping all pleasantries. I need you to sign these documents to officially join our homeowners association. The annual fee is $2,300, and there are several compliance issues that need to be addressed immediately. She shoved the papers into my hands like she was doing me a favor. I don't know why, but something about her rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was her tone, like she expected obedience without question. Maybe it was the fact that she was talking about violations and issues before I'd even unpacked all my boxes. But my instincts as an attorney, they kicked in fast. I flipped through the papers and instantly felt my blood boil. These weren't guidelines. They were rules meant to control every inch of a person's life. You needed approval just to paint your front door. Decorations for the garden required written permission. Even the mailbox had to be a specific shade of black painted, no less. I looked up from the papers. Laura was still standing there with a smug grin like she had just handed me a winning lottery ticket. I'm not signing, I told her plainly. Not because I don't understand the law but because I do. And I'm not going to be bullied into submission. Her expression faltered for just a moment like no one had ever said no to her before. And in that moment, I saw what she really was, a control freak in heels. The type of person who's used to getting her way and hates being challenged. I dealt with bullies before, but none like her. Her tone immediately hardened. You'll regret this, Mr. Thompson. This community has standards and we don't make exceptions. The way she emphasized anyone gave me chills, like there was something more behind her words. At the time, I just thought she was one of those HOA fanatics. I handed back the paperwork, told her to enjoy her day, and figured that was that. I was so wrong. 2 days later, I found a citation under my windshield wiper, $500 for a mailbox not meeting the community color code. I actually laughed out loud. My mailbox was black and just like every other mailbox on the street, but apparently, it wasn't the correct shade of black. That's when I knew a broken bar. This wasn't just a disagreement. Laura Blackwell had declared war. She didn't waste time proving what kind of person I was up against. That week, I started finding notices stuffed under my door. Mailbox gnome? Fine. Wind chimes? Fine. It felt like someone was assigned to monitor my house full-time, just waiting to pounce on the tiniest infraction. Then came the grass citation at $300 because my lawn was measured at exactly 2 3/4 inches tall. Their rule? A maximum of 3 inches. Seriously? We're talking about just a 1/4 inch of grass here. A ridiculous citation over something that barely even qualifies as a difference. And the garden gnome fine? Even more absurd. $200 for a small 6-inch figurine, tucked behind a bush where no one could spot it unless they were specifically looking. But somehow, Laura's laser vision managed to pick it out during one of her neighborhood patrols. What finally broke my patience was the wind chime violation. Mine was hung in the exact same place the previous homeowner had kept it, in a spot where at least 3 of my neighbors had identical chimes. And yet some of mine was singled out and deemed non-compliant, earning me a $350 fine. According to Laura, it didn't meet the community standards, though she couldn't quite explain why. That was the moment my background as a property rights attorney kicked in full force. Rather than react emotionally or contest each fine one by one like any average homeowner might, I stepped back and examined the situation from a broader perspective. I devoted an entire weekend to digging through the HOA's bylaws, incorporation files, and procedural documentation. What I uncovered was enlightening and devastating for Laura. She had repeatedly ignored the very rules that gave her authority in the first place. She issued citations without proper notice, skipped mandatory appeal periods, and most importantly, had gone far beyond the powers outlined in the HOA's founding documents. That's when I heard a knock at my door. It was Emily Green, the investigative journalist who lived next door. I had seen her often, always with a notebook or a camera in hand. Mid-30s, sharp-eyed, and the kind of direct that only seasoned reporters can pull off. "Luke," she said, "I've been keeping an eye on what's going on with these citations Laura's been throwing your way. I thought you should know I saw her yesterday with a couple of surveyors around your property. They were measuring and taking notes, but there weren't any posted city permits." That immediately raised red flags. Surveyors don't just pop by without reason, and they definitely don't operate without permits. As we stood on the porch, Tom Anderson strolled over. Tom, the ex-security director from across the street, had this sixth sense for trouble, probably honed over decades of watching for it. He was around 60, tall and steady, the kind of man whose observations you didn't ignore. "There's been odd activity on the block," he said, glancing toward Laura's house. "Cars I've never seen, people going in and out at strange hours. Something doesn't sit right." Coming from someone with Tom's experience, that wasn't just neighborhood gossip, it was an expert's concern. That pushed me to dig deeper. And what I found made all the fines and threats look like minor annoyances in comparison. Laura had secretly filed a boundary dispute with the county. In her claim, she stated that a 10-foot wide strip along the eastern edge of my property was part of a so-called community easement, essentially public space under the HOA's control. But here's the catch. No such easement existed in any official land records. Legally, there was no precedent for what she was claiming, yet the filing was professional, complete with polished paperwork, legal citations, and detailed reports from surveyors. Laura wasn't just harassing me on a whim. She was orchestrating a legal maneuver to take control of part of my land. She had hired lawyers, paid professionals, and formally submitted documentation to the county of Fascia, all of it aimed at forcing me into submission. All because I said no to her HOA. The level of spite was astonishing. That night, I started keeping detailed logs of everything, every citation, every odd visitor, every little change to my surroundings. I noticed someone had moved one of the garden chairs by exactly 2 inches. I hadn't touched it. That's when my legal instincts fully activated. I began assembling a case file: photos, dates, witness statements, printed emails, timestamps. I even included commentary from Emily and Tom, both of whom had been keeping their own observations. I'd handled enough harassment and property cases to know this paper trail might soon become my most valuable weapon. and judging by Laura's escalating behavior, things were definitely going to get worse before they got better. I was in my study late one evening, reviewing the evidence I had compiled, when the phone rang. It was Tom, and he sounded tense. "Luke, there's smoke coming from your direction," he said. "I'm looking out my window right now. There's an orange glow." My stomach dropped. I dropped the phone and ran to my window, and sure enough there it was, an orange shimmer dancing across the darkness, coming from the backside of my property. For a moment, I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just someone having a late-night bonfire, or a backyard barbecue, but then I caught the unmistakable, sharp smell of something burning, not wood, not food, something synthetic, a thing that shouldn't be burning, and just before midnight, a bright beam of light swept across my window. It wasn't moonlight, it was a flashlight. Turns out, that eerie orange glow wasn't my house going up in flames, thankfully. It was actually Tom's neighbor across the street, burning some old furniture in a backyard fire pit, probably against a few city ordinances, sure, but a whole lot less terrifying than what I had imagined. Still, that false alarm taught me something valuable. I was on edge, and maybe for good reason. Laura's campaign of harassment wasn't slowing down, it was picking up speed. When you start panicking over flickering lights and every little noise makes your skin crawl, that's not just paranoia, that's psychological warfare. And she was winning it, piece by piece. The next morning, I was sipping coffee, trying to convince myself I was just overreacting, when two men showed up at my doorstep. And they didn't exactly look like Jehovah's Witnesses. Both were bulky, mid-40s, dressed in sharp suits that did a poor job of hiding their muscular builds. The older one handed me a card that read Mountain Peak Security Solutions. He introduced himself as Mike. His partner didn't say a word, he just stood there, arms crossed, silently surveying my property like he was planning something. "Mr. Thompson," Mike said with a slick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "we understand there've been a few safety concerns in the area. We're here to offer our protection services." The way he said protection services had that greasy, mobster undertone to it, the kind you hear right before someone's kneecaps get broken in a movie. This wasn't community security. These guys were delivering a message. Everything about them screamed professional intimidation, from the gleaming dress shoes to the way their hands remained visibly yet obviously ready. These aren't security contractors, I thought. These are enforcers. I asked who had sent them. Mike's smile widened, just enough to unsettle me. "Let's just say certain community figures are worried about your safety," he replied. "There's been some strange activity in the area. We wouldn't want anything a broken bar unfortunate to happen to a newcomer like you." Then the silent one finally spoke, with that fake casual menace. "You know, accidents tend to happen to folks who don't cooperate with the community." It was like a bad gangster movie, except it was playing out in broad daylight on my front porch in suburban Colorado. And just a few minutes later, clipboard-wielding Steve was back, loitering suspiciously near my boundary markers. The intimidation wasn't subtle anymore. It was coordinated. I kept calm, smiled, thanked them for their concern, told them I'd think about their offer, and asked for their business cards and license info, all while memorizing their faces, their vehicle's license plate, and unbeknownst to them recording the entire conversation on my phone. They thought I was some ex-lawyer just trying to enjoy his retirement. What they didn't know was that I'd been trained to deal with threats like them. The moment they left, I pulled up my laptop and ran a deep dive on Mountain Peak Security Solutions. And what I found chilled me to the core. The company was a front registered to a P.O. box in Denver, no physical office, and listed under a shell corporation. The paper trail got even murkier the further I followed it. But here's the kicker. That shell company was part of a corporate web I recognized from earlier cases. These weren't freelance muscle. Mountain Peak was a front for organized crime, and somehow, Laura had gotten herself involved with people who didn't play games. This was no longer about neighborhood disputes or hoe drama. Laura Blackwell wasn't just a power-tripping hoe president anymore. She was outsourcing her battles to criminals. The same woman who threw a tantrum over the shade of my mailbox was now sending professional enforcers to my doorstep. It was almost too surreal to believe. That night, I got a call from Emily. Her voice was shaky. "Luke, There's a black van parked outside my house. Been sitting there for over 3 hours. Plates are covered in mud. 2 guys inside just a broken bar watching. I pulled back my curtains and sure enough there it was. A black van, parked in perfect view of both our homes. They weren't hiding. They wanted us to know we were being watched. This wasn't intimidation anymore. It was surveillance. They were studying us, our patterns, our schedules, planning something. I told Emily to stay indoors and keep everything locked up. I needed to think fast. Calling the police crossed my mind, but I knew how that would go. The van would drive off, wait a few days, then return. These guys were smart. They knew how to toe the legal line while delivering a very illegal message. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just some cabin-dwelling retiree with a shovel. I was a former federal judge, the kind that used to approve wiretaps and racketeering indictments. These creeps had no idea what kind of person they were dealing with. Just then, my phone rang again. It was Tom. His voice was tight, urgent. "Luke," he said, "I just saw 2 more cars drive through the neighborhood, a broken bar. They were driving slow, too slow, circling the block more than once. This wasn't random anymore, it was calculated, and I knew exactly what that meant. Surveillance is never the end game, it's always the step before something worse." By the time I realized what they were doing with the boundary dispute and the false easement claim, the paperwork had already been pushed through. But that was nothing compared to what happened next. It was the kind of nightmare you don't wake up from, because I was wide awake the entire time. Those containers I'd spotted on the thermal footage from my security cameras weren't filled with tools or building materials. They were loaded with accelerant. By the time I grabbed my phone and got through to 911, it was already too late. Orange flames had begun licking up the siding of my home. The smoke was so thick I could barely catch a breath. I had 3 minutes, maybe less, to grab what I could and escape before the whole place turned to ash. Looking back, I still don't know how I kept my head, but somehow, I managed to snatch my laptop, the one with all the case files, photos, correspondence, and hours of evidence I had gathered. The fire department arrived in minutes, but the damage had been done. They couldn't save anything meaningful. I knelt where my front porch had been. My fingertips sank into black soot. The heat was gone, but its echo still vibrated through the air. Every memory, every artifact of my life burned to nothing. Childhood photos, the first law books I ever studied, my late wife's vinyl records, now fused into a single melted disc I pulled from the rubble like some cruel joke. Later, they estimated the damages at $250,000, but that number didn't come close to measuring what was truly lost. Then came the cherry on top, Laura Blackwell. She arrived about 20 minutes after the fire crews, walking down the street with this picture-perfect mask of horror and sympathy on her face, like she was starring in some amateur theater production. "Oh my God, Luke," she gasped, eyes wide and full of fake concern. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." She placed her hand gently on my arm like we were friends. "You must be devastated. Listen, my guest house is available if you need somewhere to stay." It took everything in me not to burst out laughing. The nerve, the performance. She was selling it hard and people were buying. Neighbors had started to gather. Some looked concerned, but others were nodding at her like she was some kind of hero for offering help. They were calling it an accident. The fire chief mumbled something about faulty wiring or a potential gas leak. All standard explanations for house fires that begin around midnight. No one, it seemed, was seriously considering Orson. No one except Tom. He stood across the street, arms folded, eyes locked on mine. And in that one look, I knew, he understood exactly what had really happened. The next morning, an insurance investigator arrived, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp. "Mr. Thompson," he said, thumbing through some forms, "I need to ask you a few questions about recent disputes you've had with neighbors." He didn't waste time. "Our preliminary analysis suggests this fire began in multiple places at once," he continued, "which is not typical for accidental fires." For the first time since the blaze, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe someone was going to take this seriously. But then he kept going, and the direction of his questions made it painfully clear he suspected me. Standing in the charred remains of my own kitchen, I found myself having to defend myself against the idea that I had burned my house down, that I had set the fire to claim insurance money. Why? Because I had been acting erratically, because I'd had confrontations with neighbors, because some very suspicious individuals had been seen visiting me, at least, according to the version of events Laura had planted throughout the neighborhood. She had played the long game, and she had played it flawlessly. I didn't call anyone that first day, or the second. I just sat there, watching the ash fall like dirty snow, until Emily showed up, a camera in hand, eyes scanning everything. Her instincts had kicked in. "Luke," she whispered when the investigator was out of earshot. "I got some of it on video. My security system has been recording around the clock ever since this started. I caught two figures moving around your property right before the fire broke out. The footage wasn't perfect, it was dark, grainy, but it was something. For the first time since I watched my life go up in flames, I felt a spark of hope, a small, flickering ember of possibility." That night, I sat alone in a dingy motel about 10 miles from Maple Grove, staring at my laptop screen, wondering what my next step should be. And that's when it hit me. This whole time, I'd been thinking like a victim, waiting, reacting, letting Laura dictate the terms. But that wasn't who I was, not really. I was a federal judge, a litigator, a man who'd spent decades unraveling lies and exposing corruption. There was nothing left but soot and steel beams, and in the silence of that motel room, I heard myself whisper, "This ends." Standing in the ruins of 2 decades of memories, I realized this wasn't just about a dispute anymore. This was war, murder, conspiracy, federal arson. That's what it had come to. By day 4, I finally unlocked the steel case tucked away beneath my beta, the one I hadn't opened since I left Boston. Inside was the only backup plan I ever really trusted. I scrolled through old contacts until I found the number I needed. Rachel Green, a seasoned detective with the Denver PD and someone I had worked with on numerous organized crime cases back when I was still prosecuting full-time. If anyone would take this seriously, if anyone could take this seriously, it was Rachel. I didn't know if her number still worked after all this time, but I called it anyway. The second it started ringing, I skipped the formalities. "Rachel, this is Judge Luke Thompson. Someone just torched my house in an act of federal arson and I need your help." There was a long pause on the other end, 5 seconds of silence that felt like 5 hours, and then, her tone changed from surprise to razor-sharp focus. "Luke, a broken bar, did you just say you're a federal judge? Since when?" I chuckled. Despite everything, not even my old colleagues knew I'd been quietly confirmed to the federal bench. I had planned to start the new chapter after a few months of peaceful retirement. Clearly, fate had other plans. "It's recent," I told her, "but that's not the point. What matters is someone burned down my home in a coordinated attack, a hired muscle, organized crime, and it all leads back to the president of my HOA." Before she could ask if I'd lost my mind, I added, "I've got documents, statements, and partial surveillance footage. I'm not speculating, I'm presenting evidence." Her reply was immediate. "I'm on my way. Don't speak to anyone else. Don't leave your motel. If you're right, you're still in danger." 2 hours later, my dingy motel room was transformed into a full-blown federal task force command center. Rachel arrived with a team of FBI agents from the Denver field office. They came equipped with laptops, forensic kits, and enough firepower to investigate the cartel. Agent Sarah Martinez, who specialized in arson and organized crime, laid out my files and evidence across the motel bed like puzzle pieces. "Judge Thompson," she said with a nod, "and yeah, I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good hearing someone use the title I'd earned. This is some of the most complete evidence I've ever seen from a civilian. Honestly, you've already done half our job." I remembered those 3 dusty boxes marked HOA Archive in the crawl space. I hadn't opened them since the depositions, but I ripped the tape off now. Inside was more than enough to deepen the investigation. But what really caught the agent's attention was the connection between Mountain Peak Security and a notorious crime family I had helped prosecute years ago. Agent Martinez pulled up current intel on the organization. What she showed us was disturbing. The leadership had changed but the infrastructure hadn't. They had rebranded under the term Suburban Consulting, offering high-end harassment and intimidation to white-collar clients looking for plausible deniability. And based on the financial trail, Laura Blackwell had become one of their clients. The next morning, with search warrants in hand, the FBI raided both Laura's home and the fake offices of Mountain Peak. I wasn't allowed on site, of course, but Rachel kept me in the loop with constant updates, and with every call, the news tightened. Laura's laptop was a goldmine. Emails stretching back 3 weeks showed she had been coordinating neighborhood security and property control strategies with Mountain Peak. Bank statements revealed a $20,000 transfer to a so-called consulting firm registered to the same Denver post office box as Mountain Peak Security. Still, instinct wasn't enough. We needed proof, and we got it. From Mountain Peak's own files, the FBI uncovered complete surveillance logs, the timelines of my daily activities, timestamps, images of my property from multiple angles, and an escalation plan titled Property Disposal. According to Agent Martinez, this language matched phrasing found in other arson-for-hire cases involving the same syndicate. This wasn't petty-ho drama anymore. Laura had gone full criminal, contracting professional arsonists to systematically dismantle my life. 2 days after I called in help, Laura appeared. No clipboard, no smug smile, just her standing at the edge of the tree line, expression blank, watching me like someone trying to process the collapse of everything they thought they controlled. The news had leaked within 24 hours. Anna Drama Nest ran the full story, and it spread like wildfire. The media had a field day. HOA president allegedly hires crime syndicate to burn down federal judge's home. Suddenly, Laura's public image, the one she had so carefully crafted, was in free fall. The nonprofit where she worked placed her on administrative leave, pending investigation. The HOA board didn't. They called an emergency meeting and unanimously removed her as president that same night. I'll admit, watching her fall from her self-made pedestal was deeply satisfying. Emilia Sharp as ever handed me a printout of the article she published for the Denver Post. She had been working behind the scenes this entire time, digging into Laura's past, uncovering inconsistencies, building a parallel narrative that ran alongside mine. We weren't just rebuilding a case anymore, we were reclaiming the truth. What Emily uncovered in the following weeks was nothing short of astonishing. Digging through public records, background reports, and community forums, she painted a much larger picture of Laura Blackwell, and it wasn't pretty. Laura had a pattern. In every community she lived in, she'd found her way into leadership roles in neighborhood organizations. And every single time, she'd used those positions to target, harass, and intimidate anyone who didn't fall in line with her control. She had been asked to resign from 2 previous HOAs in other states, and civil lawsuits from former neighbors were still pending, and most of them citing behavior disturbingly similar to what I had just experienced. This wasn't just my battle anymore. Then, 3 days after the FBI raids, Rachel called me with the update I had been waiting for. "Luke, we've got her." Laura Blackwell was being arrested. Federal charges, conspiracy, arson, civil rights violations, and under the federal hate crime statute, no less. According to Rachel, the maximum sentence was 50 years, and that was before factoring in the organized crime enhancements. I asked her how the hate crime charges applied. Rachel explained, "The FBI found evidence suggesting Laura had targeted me, in part, because she saw me as an outsider, someone who didn't fit the image she had of her community." That detail, buried in one of her emails, turned this from malicious HOA politics into something far more serious. Later that night, an envelope slid under my motel room door. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single photograph, me, in judicial robes, handing down a sentence. They knew, whoever was still out there, whatever remnants of this network hadn't been rolled up in the raid, so they knew who I really was now. The next morning, Rachel and the FBI returned to the motel. My evidence had already built the spine of their case. Agent Sarah Martinez, still working the investigation, had her team scanning through every document and correspondence Laura had left behind. The more they dug, the worse it got. Mountain Peak Security, the so-called consulting firm Laura had paid $20,000 to, turned out to be a shell front connected to a crime family I had helped take down years ago. That group had rebranded themselves as Suburban Conflict Resolution Consultants, offering services like surveillance, intimidation, and when necessary property elimination. Their business was clean on paper, but the files we recovered told a different story. Inside Mountain Peak's office, the FBI found surveillance logs detailing my movements down to the minute, high-resolution photographs of my property, taken from multiple angles, a color-coded timeline that escalated from noise complaints to property disposal. Agent Martinez looked up from the report and told me plainly, "Judge Thompson, this language is standard for premeditated arson. We've seen it before in organized crime cases linked to contract fires." Laura didn't just make my life difficult. She hired a professional criminal network to systematically destroy it. The takedown was swift. 6:17 a.m. Three black SUVs pulled into the cul-de-sac. The sound of tires grinding gravel woke up the whole block. Curtains twitched. Mrs. Henderson stepped onto her porch in pearls and panic. Laura was already outside, barefoot in a robe, shielding her eyes from the flashing lights as agents moved in. Rachel had timed the raids perfectly, with Mountain Peak already dismantled. All that remained was Laura's carefully built illusion of innocence. And now that was gone too. By noon, every major news outlet had picked up the story. Anna Drama Nest ran the headline first: HOA President hired criminal syndicate to burn down federal judge's home. Other headlines followed. Within hours, Laura was placed on administrative leave by the nonprofit she ran. The HOA board held an emergency vote and removed her as president. Her reputation collapsed publicly, in real time. Watching it all unravel wasn't just cathartic, it was justice. Later that evening, Emily handed me the first draft of her expose copyright for the Denver Post. She had been quietly working in parallel, investigating Laura's past and following a paper trail that now extended across multiple states. Her article was meticulous, brutal, and completely damning. We weren't just closing a case, we were exposing a system, one that had allowed people like Laura to weaponize suburban order, and one that had finally been dragged into the light. She hadn't just hired thugs to rattle me. Laura Blackwell had recruited organized criminals to methodically destroy my life. Across the street, a man yelled, "You said this was for property values." Someone kicked over the HOA bulletin board. Another resident filmed the chaos while muttering, "Anna Drama Nest is gonna eat this up." And they did. News of the federal judge arson investigation hit the media within 24 hours, a typical timeline for high-profile cases, especially when public officials are involved. But what made this different was how fast it exploded. Suddenly, every journalist in Colorado wanted the scoop on the HOA president accused of hiring the mob to burn down a federal judge's home. Laura's perfectly curated image, a pillar of the community, nonprofit leader, moral compass of Maple Grovia, began to disintegrate in real time. Her employer, a local nonprofit, placed her on immediate administrative leave. The HOA board, once her inner circle, called an emergency session and voted unanimously to strip her of the presidency. And I won't lie, watching Laura's carefully built empire collapse brick by brick was a broken bar satisfying. But the best moment came later that evening, when Emily handed me her article, the exclusive for Anna Drama Nest. She'd been quietly investigating Laura for weeks. Her findings weren't just damning, they were systemic. Laura Blackwell had a history of weaponizing power. In every neighborhood she moved into, she carved her way into leadership, only to harass anyone who resisted her control. She had been forced to resign from 2 previous HOA boards, and there were ongoing civil lawsuits filed by former neighbors who had been victims of her pattern campaigns of coercion. This wasn't just about me anymore. Then, 3 days after the FBI raids, Rachel called. "Luke, we've got her." Laura Blackwell was being arrested. Charges: federal conspiracy, arson, civil rights violations, and shockingly hate crimes. Rachel explained that during the investigation, the FBI discovered communications suggesting that Laura had singled me out specifically because I was an outsider, a status protected under federal civil rights law. The maximum sentence, 50 years, and that was before organized crime enhancements. When the cruiser pulled away that morning with Laura in handcuffs, I didn't cheer, I didn't even smile. I turned back inside and quietly rinsed the same coffee mug I'd been holding since 5 a.m. Justice doesn't roar, sometimes it just exhales. But then Rachel hit me with the question I'd been dreading. Lucia Broken Bar, the U.S. Attorney's Office wants to know if you're planning to recuse yourself from any future cases involving this crime network, given your direct involvement. It was fair, and it would haunt my judicial career, because how do you sit on the bench sworn to impartiality when you stared your enemies in the eyes as they lit the match? I told her the truth. I'd deal with the ethics later. Right now, I just wanted justice. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. I sat in my motel room, surrounded by legal pads, court filings, and memories that now only existed in photographs Emily managed to recover. This wasn't just my first major appearance as a federal judge. It was the most personal case of my life. Laura thought she was playing chess with a tired old retiree. She hadn't realized she'd picked a fight with someone who had written briefs for the Supreme Court, who trained federal prosecutors, and who had friends in agencies she'd never even heard of. She saw a porch light. What she didn't see was the federal arsenal behind it. The game was about to change permanently. Laura Blackwell was about to learn what happens when you threaten the wrong man. But it didn't stop with her arrest. The FBI began uncovering something deeper, something tied to the HOA's finances, shadow companies, and a name I hadn't heard in 15 years, a name I thought had vanished. At the next home meeting, if you could even call it that, people showed up with lawn chairs and paper plates. There were no agendas, no Robert's rules, just eye contact, awkward nods, and quiet apologies passed over baked beans and lemonade. Then came the preliminary hearing, and let me tell you, it wasn't like any courtroom I'd ever seen. And I've sat in more of them than most people see in a lifetime. Laura Blackwell showed up with Marcus Webb, arguably the most expensive defense attorney in Denver, but not even his reputation could dig her out of the mountain of evidence she was buried under. Gone was the designer power suit, the smug smile of the HOA Queen Bee. What sat at that defense table was a pale, trembling figure, someone beginning to grasp the magnitude of the machine she had set in motion. Webb attempted what I can only call a provocation, a defense claiming Laura had been pushed to extreme measures by my so-called abuse of judicial intimidation. But then Agent Martinez took the stand and unspooled Laura's entire playbook, step by calculated step from petty citations to coordinated arson. She presented emails with Mountain Peak Security, the $20,000 bank transfer, detailed surveillance logs of my routine. Then came Emily's testimony, precise, irrefutable, photos, witness statements, and the footage. When the security video showing the arsonists played in court, you could actually see jurors flinch. This wasn't graffiti. It was a targeted operation by trained professionals. And when Tom Anderson took the stand, his 2 decades in private security made every word land like a gavel strike. When Webb tried to downplay Tom's interpretation of a call Laura made about a permanent solution, Tom simply said, "Sir, I've spent 20 years listening to people plan illegal activity. I know what conspiracy sounds like." And then came the final blow in my recordings. Thanks to Colorado's one-party consent laws, every threat Laura made, every slip of guilt, every whispered admission was legally admissible. The moment she realized what was being played, her whole body changed. She turned sheet white, grabbed her lawyer's arm, as if she could stop the courtroom with her bare hands. Agent Martinez followed up with evidence of Laura's historials in other states, restraining orders, dropped charges, ongoing lawsuits. The pattern was clear. Laura Blackwell was a serial predator, using HOAs like her personal fiefdoms, weaponizing bureaucracy and law to silence, harass, and destroy. Then Laura took the stand, and it was an absolute disaster. The prosecution systematically unraveled her story using her own recordings, documents, and witnesses. She claimed the payment was for security consulting. She said permanent solution meant legal resolution. Even her own attorney started shrinking in his chair. The jury didn't even try to hide their disbelief. Judge Morrison's ruling was thorough and brutal. Ms. Blackwell, the evidence reflects a pattern of escalating criminal behavior posing a clear and present danger to any community you reside in. The court finds probable cause that you orchestrated a campaign of harassment and intimidation, culminating in an act of domestic terrorism against a federal judge. Bail, $500,000. Laura would stay locked up until trial. 3 months later, we went to trial. The prosecution had only strengthened their case. More digital evidence, more testimony, more documentation of her multi-state pattern of HOA abuse. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict: guilty on all counts of conspiracy, arson, civil rights violations, and criminal racketeering. At her sentencing, Judge Morrison got creative. 14 years in federal prison, 5 years of supervised release, $400,000 in restitution for emotional distress, damages, and legal costs. But it didn't stop there. The FBI's deeper investigation uncovered financial fraud at Laura's nonprofit, including that she had used donor funds to pay Mountain Peak Security. She was hit with additional charges: mail fraud and money laundering. Her final sentence: 18 years in federal prison. And Mountain Peak, dismantled. Its executives received 5 8-year sentences for their roles in the conspiracy. The HOA bulletin board that once held Laura's announcements now bore a laminated clipping of Emily's headline from Anna Dromanest. From president to prisoner, the suburban empire of Laura Blackwell crumbles. The ripple effects from Laura's downfall didn't stop at her sentencing. The Maple Grove Homeowners Association was officially dissolved by unanimous vote. All those restrictive covenants that once terrorized families, gone. And the irony? Property values went up by 20% after the HOA rules were lifted. For the first time in years, Maple Grove started to feel like an actual neighborhood. Emily's article series turned viral when national media picked it up. The story became a cautionary tale, a textbook case on what happens when unchecked HOA power meets unchecked ambition. State legislatures took notice. Several passed new laws to prevent similar abuses of HOA authority. Legal scholars began citing the case as a turning point to how a civil dispute spiraled into federal racketeering charges. 6 months later, I got a letter, handwritten, from Laura, full of self-pity, excuses, and justifications. She claimed she was the real victim. She even asked me to write a character reference for her appeal. Said I should understand the meaning of mercy and second chances. I read it twice, then quietly filed it away, not because I was tempted, but because I wanted to remember what real justice looks like. Because yes, justice is slow, but when it finally arrives it is certain, and it doesn't flinch in the face of people who build their lives by destroying others. I rebuilt from scratch. Charred lumber, calloused hands, no permits, no codes, just a sapling in the ashes, planted where my old kitchen once stood. My new house, funded by insurance and restitution, sits quietly at the corner of what used to be the most feared cul-de-sac in town. Now, kids ride bikes without citations. Neighbors chat over fences without looking over their shoulders. Gardens bloom in every color. Painted porches, mismatched shutters, wind chimes. Real freedom, real community. No more tyranny disguised as standards. Laura's appeal was denied. She's now enrolled in ethics and conflict resolution classes offered courtesy of the state. Mrs. Henderson moved in with her sister. Rumor says it's somewhere outside of an HOA district. Smart move, because here's the truth. HOA rules never built harmony. Mutual respect and decency did. And Laura? She learned that lesson in a cell, not a meeting room. The whole neighborhood is stronger now because someone stood up. And if there's a moral to all of this, it's simple. Never underestimate someone until you know who they really are, especially not when they've spent their life prosecuting people exactly like you. Laura Blackwell thought I was just another quiet retiree. She gambled on intimidation, manipulation, and fire. But she lost so spectacularly. Sometimes justice is cold, and it tastes just as sweet as you hoped. I still keep the envelope, the one with my photo in the robes, handed down like a warning, not because I need the reminder, but because someone else might. And that's what people forget. Real power doesn't shout, it watches, it waits, and when it strikes, it leaves paper trails and prison sentences, not bruises. Maple Grove doesn't look the same now. No more board meetings, no more threats in polite envelopes, just neighbors, gardens, peace. Maybe that's the real message here. Don't try to control someone when you don't even know what they used to control. If you're still here, drop a comment. Tell me what hit hardest. And hey, if this story found the nerve it was meant to, that super thanks button's right below. Catch you in the next one. This is Anna Dramanest, signing off, and trust me, you'll be hooked.